Good evening, y'all, and good evening to everybody who is watching this as it is going to be aired in probably nighttime. But welcome to another great episode of Mason Dixon Podcast with y'all's hosts, Colonel John Rebel from Michigan and Cousin Vinny from New Jersey Flaggers. It is time for one of our amazing history nights. John, as always, does amazing research and amazing programs. And I'm going to turn it over to John in just a second. But I want to remind everybody that the views and opinions expressed here on Mason Dixon Podcast and on MAD are our own and just our own views, and they do not represent the views and opinions of any other person, group, or organization. Remember that stars help us put up statues. So if y'all are watching this on Save Southern Heritage Florida or on MAD, send us some stars. It goes a long way, y'all. Also, consider becoming a member at Save Southern Heritage Florida. We are setting precedents to inspire other states to stand up for their history, as well as helping to protect our memorials at the legal level, something that has not been done in a while. Also, check out Defend Arlington and our other fundraisers that we are doing on Monuments Across Dixie. 3 amazing groups doing wonderful things. All right, Colonel John Rebel, give us the rundown on what you're going to be presenting on today.
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me on tonight or today, whenever anybody's watching this. Thanks for having me on, Vinny. It's always a pleasure to be here on the podcast. And, this is what we do. History is our thing. That's right. Just recently we passed a milestone anniversary of a very sad and terrible event in not only Southern history, but in our nation's history, in the United States history. And we missed an opportunity to do anything for it that day. But today's a good day to kind of make up for it because it's the gentleman's birthday. And today we're going to talk about the unjust judicial murder of a true patriot in the cause for Southern independence. So if you want to go ahead and start throwing up the slides, we'll get the project rolling. So for 15 minutes on the morning of November the 10th, 1865, a human body with a noose around the neck dangled from a rope attached to a scaffold outside the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. The body that hung there in the breeze that day was that of a 41-year-old man named Hartman Heinrich Wirz. According to the official record, justice was served, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could be further from the truth. Henry Wirz was born on November 25th, this date, in 1823 in Switzerland. As a young man, he aspired to be a physician, but his family couldn't afford to provide him with such an education. Instead, he learned how to be a merchant and worked in a department store. He was married in 1845 to Emily Oswald, with whom he had a son and a daughter. Sources say that in 1847, Henry was tried and sentenced to 12 years in prison on charges of fraud and embezzlement. I haven't been able to find much information on the matter, certainly not in English, but some sources say that it might have been a simple matter of being unable to pay back money borrowed from his place of employment. Whatever the case, he was released the very next year, and his sentence was commuted to 12 years of exile from the canton or county of Zurich. Forced to leave in order to be free, his wife refused to go with him. The two were separated, and she obtained a decree of divorce several years afterward. Now, Henry first went to Moscow in Russia, and then in 1849 came to the United States through New York. He initially lived in northeast Massachusetts, near the New Hampshire border. He worked as a translator in a factory for nearly 5 years before heading southwest to a state near to my heart, Kentucky. There, near Hopkinsville, he fell in with a doctor and was finally able to start learning hands-on how to practice medicine while working as a doctor's assistant. He was taught how to perform minor surgeries and put casts on broken bones. In the early to mid-1850s, he tried to establish his own homeopathic medicine practice in Cadiz, Kentucky. It was also during this time period when he remarried to Elizabeth Stavels Wolfe, a widow with 2 young daughters. Together, they would have 2 more daughters in 1855 and 59, respectively. Now, around 1855, Wirz moved his new family even further south to Madison Parish, Louisiana, where he made the acquaintance of a wealthy banker and landowner, Levin R. Marshall, in 1856. Marshall owned a plantation called Cabin Teal, which is less than 20 miles up and across the Mississippi River from Vicksburg. Marshall hired Wirz as the plantation's overseer and allowed him to set up a practice there for homeopathic medicine. 5 years later, this stability was all upended when Abraham Lincoln was elected U.S. President in November of 1860, and subsequently, Louisiana became the 6th of 7 southern states to secede from the Union in January of 1861. The next month, these states would form the Confederate States of America. Shortly after, the Lincoln administration came to power in the United States and inaugurated war upon the recently seceded Confederate States. Henry Wirz enlisted to serve with the 4th Louisiana Infantry Battalion in the Confederate Army in 1861. After receiving a deep tissue wound while serving as an aide to General Joe Johnston at the Battle of Seven Pines in the summer of 1862, Wirz was promoted to the rank of captain and assigned to serve on the staff of General John Winder, who was in charge of Confederate prisoner of war camps. The picture that you see here is said to have been taken around 1863 while Captain Wirz was on a furlough due to his injury on the right arm. And he was actually over in Switzerland when the picture was taken. In February of 1864, the Confederate government established a large military prison in a small Georgia town of Andersonville. Tapped to take command of this new facility, known as Camp Sumter, was Captain Wirz, who would later be promoted to the rank of major. Now, Camp Sumter was originally designed to hold about 10,000 prisoners of war. In a very short time, it wound up holding nearly 3 times as many prisoners. The reason for this increase was, in large part, the total war policy of the Lincoln administration, a part of which was to end the system of parole on honor, which would include exchanging prisoners between the 2 sides. The Union had been decimating Southern food and medical supplies, and their means of delivering such items to Confederate troops. The Confederate soldiers on the battlefield had to be fed to continue defending Southern freedom. But more often than not, in the later years of combat, they had to wage war on nearly empty stomachs. If the Confederate government could barely feed or give medicine to their own troops, how could they be expected to feed and care for prisoners much better? Major Wirz did all that he could to better the situation of the prisoners placed under his care. As ExploreSouthernHistory.com explained, quote, "The size of the stockade was expanded as the number of prisoners swelled. He established hospital facilities outside the stockade walls, and he allowed prisoners to arrest, try, and execute the ringleaders of the Raiders, a prison gang that preyed on other inmates," unquote. Wirz even tried to return thousands of prisoners to the Union Army without requesting for any exchange. Union authorities would not take back their own soldiers, saying that they had no authority to relieve the sufferings of these men from their own army. As a result of these Union Army actions, 13,000 captured Union soldiers would die at the prison in Andersonville by the war's end in April 1865. Major Wirz, who had done nothing aside from follow orders and faithfully execute his duty to the best of his ability under the circumstances that he was given, he could have ran and hid it. He could have slipped off to Europe if he believed himself to be in some kind of danger of legal punishment, but he didn't. He did believe that some of the released prisoners might blame him for the conditions of the prison and might try to harm him. So he wrote to a Union general who was there in the area by that point in time, in the month of May, to request for a safe conduct pass or a guard to temporarily protect him. Instead, the general sent troops to arrest Wirz and bring him in for questioning. The arresting officer, pictured here, Captain Henry Wirz, told Wirz in front of his family that there's nothing to fear, and that after answering questions, he would soon be released to return to his family. Wirz and his family even played host to these Union troops for part of the day on May 7th, 1865, even serving them dinner before leaving that afternoon. Little did Henry Wirz know that by allowing himself to be taken into U.S. federal custody, he had jumped into the mouth of a lion, one that was rabid with bloodlust after a long 4-year war and the assassination of a president. The first place he was taken was Macon, Georgia, where he was put on a train for Washington, D.C. He arrived on May 10th, the same day that President Jefferson Davis was being taken captive by Union troops back in Georgia. In the capital city of the Union government, he was held at the old brick Capitol prison, and he would remain there a prisoner for more than 2 months before any formal charges were brought against him. And I got to get to the next slide here momentarily. All right, and this here is a digital recreation of what the old brick Capitol prison looked like. On August the 21st, the same special military commission that tried and convicted the alleged conspirators in the Lincoln assassination came together to plan their trial of Wirz. 2 days later, the charges of conspiracy and murder were falsely leveled against him. The trial ran until October 24th, during which the commission deprived Wirz of his basic legal rights, refused to hear key witnesses in his defense, and accepted testimony against him that was later proven false. Despite there being zero, absolutely no proof whatsoever of any instance where Wirz actually committed murder or ordered the deaths of any specific prisoners at Camp Sumter, on October 24th, the verdict of guilty was rendered by the commission, and he was subsequently sentenced to death. The new president of the United States, Andrew Johnson, pictured here, approved the final decision and directed that the execution would take place before noon on November the 10th. On November 6th, Wirz sent a letter to President Johnson asking for clemency. It was hand-delivered by his attorney, Lewis Shade, to the hand of President Johnson. But Johnson never took any action upon it and later denied ever receiving such a letter. On the night of November the 9th, attorney Lewis Shade, pictured here, was approached by a messenger claiming to represent a member of President Johnson's cabinet. The emissary informed him that if Wirz would implicate Jefferson Davis in the alleged atrocities committed at Andersonville, his sentence would be commuted. Shade took this offer to Major Wirz, who replied, quote, "Mr. Shade, you know that I've always told you that I do not know anything about Jefferson Davis. He had no connection with me as to what was done at Andersonville. If I knew anything of him, I would not become a traitor against him or anybody else, even to save my life." Father Francis Xavier Boyle of St. Peter's Catholic Church near Capitol Hill served the spiritual needs of the major during his imprisonment. And he also received a visit with a similar author to pass along to Wirz from men connected to the president's cabinet. He passed it along to Major Wirz just hours before the execution. And according to Father Boyle, quote, "The major was very indignant and said that while he was innocent of the charges for which he was about to suffer death, he would not purchase his liberty by perjury, and a crime such as was made the condition of his freedom." The hour of injustice had now come. Like the Romans feeding Christians to the lions, the U.S. government sold 250 tickets to the execution event. Many more lined the rooftops and even climbed up into nearby trees to witness this literal human sacrifice at the altar of the Lincoln cult. Pictured here is the exterior and backside of the old brick Capitol prison. At 10 o'clock on the morning of November the 10th, Union officers entered Wirz's room of imprisonment on the 3rd floor of the prison for the purpose of taking him to the gallows. The following is how the scene unfolded according to the New York Times. Quote, "Without any exhibition of nervousness, he even indulged in pleasantry as to his appearance in the black shroud, and said also that he hoped to have a white gown soon. The officers proceeded to pinion his arms behind his back, but found the handcuffs would not slip onto his right arm, it being much swollen, which was due to the old injury from the Battle of Seven Pines. His limbs were therefore all left free until he reached the scaffold. As they were leaving the room, Wirz turned to the mantel and with as much nonchalance as if he had been in a barroom, took up a bottle of whiskey and pouring out a liberal draught, drank it down with apparent relish. Then taking a chew of tobacco, he took his place in the procession, which was led by the provost marshal. Then the two priests, then Wirz, the guards next, and Captain Walbridge in the rear, in which order they mounted the scaffold, the prisoner exhibiting much steadiness in his much steadiness in his movements. The following pictures that you're going to see are actual pictures that were taken that day of the Wirz execution. I continue now with the New York Times. Stepping upon the trap, he seated himself upon a stool, the noose so soon to be his fatal snare dangling over his head. Major Russell then proceeded to read the order, reciting the finding of the court and the approval of the sentence by the president. The reading was finished at 10:20, and Wirz was directed to stand up. Major Russell asked him if he had anything to say publicly, to which he replied, no. Father Boyle then recited the service of the Catholic Church for the dying, to which Wirz responded in a low tone. During these few moments, shouts could be heard from the soldiers in the treetops of "Hang him! Andersonville! Remember Andersonville!" and others not calculated to increase his calm demeanor. But he paid no attention to them and preserved his cheerful expression of countenance throughout. At 30 minutes past 10, his hands and legs having been pinioned by straps, the noose was adjusted by L.J. Richardson, military detective, and the doomed man shook hands with the priests and officers. At this point, other sources report the major commanding the execution detail told Wirz, "I have my orders," just before he put the black hood over Wirz's head. Major Wirz then spoke his last words. "I know what orders are, Major, and I am being hanged for obeying them." The New York Times continues. At exactly 32 minutes past 10, Sylvester Ballou, another detective, at the signal of the provost marshal, put his foot upon the fatal spring. The trap fell with a heavy noise. This image shows Sylvester Ballou putting his foot on the spring and springing the trap. And this next image shows the scaffold cleared of all of its participants. And you can see lower in the picture the hooded head of Major Henry Wirz hanging there, his feet dangling below, executed for crimes he did not commit. Per a report made by 2 Union Army surgeons, quote, "After the fall of the drop, several slight shrugs of the shoulders, lasting for a few seconds, were noticed, after which the body remained quiet until 15 minutes had elapsed when it was lowered. Life was pronounced extinct, and it was removed to the hospital." The U.S. government provided no dignity to the man in the immediate aftermath of his death. Rather than release the body to the family, his remains were taken and given a post-mortem exam, during which a portion of the major's neck and most of his right arm was removed from the body for further examination. What was left was then buried in a shallow trench beside those who had been executed for the Lincoln assassination within the grounds of the U.S. Arsenal at Washington, D.C., pictured here. 2 years later, these graves were dug up and moved to another location within the Arsenal grounds to accommodate a construction project. It would be 2 more years before President Johnson would release the remains for a Christian burial in February of 1869. When Louis Shade, representing the Wirz family, came to retrieve the major's remains, he was shocked to find that not only was his arm and neck bone missing, but his skull as well, which had been surgically removed, and the flesh of the head sewed up again sometime after the post-execution autopsy, probably when the remains were exhumed and reburied in 1867. Shade protested this condition, but the government refused to return the missing neck bone and the arm bones, which the neck bone you can see pictured here, both are in a medical museum and can still be seen on display to this day. The government also claimed no knowledge of what happened to the skull, though some were said to have remembered a Union soldier in the old Capitol prison displaying what he claimed was the skull of Wirz 2 years earlier. Around 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Sunday, February 28, 1869, more than 3 years and 3 months after his unjust judicial murder, Major Hartman Heinrich Henry Wirz was laid to rest in a brand new walnut coffin at Mount Olivet Cemetery in northeastern Washington, D.C. A simple service attended by around 50 people was conducted by the major's old friend and pastor, Father Boyle. Mrs. Louis Shade placed a handsome evergreen wreath upon the casket on behalf of the major's family, who were not able to travel in time to be present for the service. Many years later, in a letter to President Jefferson Davis, Father Boyle stated, quote, "I attended the major to the scaffold, and he died in the peace of God and praying for his enemies. I know that he was indeed innocent of all the cruel charges on which his life was sworn away. Unquote. A simple flat headstone with only his last name inscribed was installed around the time of the burial. Unfortunately, his last name was misspelled. Around the beginning of 1957, thanks to the efforts of author and historian Colonel Thomas Spencer and funding by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a new headstone was placed at the gravesite with the following inscription: Captain Henry Wirz, CSA, Confederate hero, martyr, died November 10th, 1865. And it is this marker with the correctly spelled name but wrong rank, which one finds when visiting the gravesite today. A Southern Cross of Honor was added to the gravesite at some point later in time. On August 14th, 1981, the Sons of Confederate Veterans posthumously awarded Wirz with the Confederate Medal of Honor. In 1990, on the 125th anniversary of the Major's martyrdom, the Major's great-grandnephew from Switzerland joined members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and reenactors from all over the United States at Mount Olivet Cemetery to give Henry Wirz the pomp and circumstance of a military funeral, which included cannon fire and a 21-gun salute. The old brick Capitol prison, where this extreme miscarriage of justice took place, was demolished in 1929. In a sick, twisted sense of irony, the site is now occupied by the United States Supreme Court building. It is shameful that the United States government continues to keep a portion of Henry Wirz remains on public exhibit as a medical oddity, and it's reprehensible that this government has not given the man a posthumous pardon after 16 decades of mounted evidence to prove his conviction and execution was unjust. For nearly 160 years, the federal government has propagated the falsehood of Henry Wirz's guilt in regards to Andersonville, but they only do so as a smokescreen. They never come forward to admit their responsibility for the suffering at Andersonville, nor do they tell about the horrors that occurred at northern prison camps, like Point Lookout in Maryland, Johnson's Island and Camp Chase in Ohio, Elmira in New York, Louisville Prison in Kentucky, Western Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, Grafton State Prison in St. Louis, Missouri, Fort Pulaski in Georgia, Rock Island and Camp Douglas in Illinois, and Fort Delaware. The horrors that took place there, not only were they awful, but they were intentional, and that makes them even worse. As for the subject of today's talk, Major Henry Wirz was a brother in Christ and an honorable soldier of the Confederate military, and as such, he should be honored by all who love that which is pure and just. We must never forget this atrocious moment in the history of the United States. We must never forget the story of the Honorable Major Hartman Heinrich Wirz. Rest in peace, Major, a true martyr in the cause of Southern independence. And that's the conclusion.
Great job as always, Jon. And you know what I love about your programs is that you cover the person in depth. I had no idea that he was into homeopathic medicine. For those that don't know or who are new to this program, we've had Nurse Nicole on here, who is a homeopathic nurse. I practice that form of alternative healing as well. We've had Nurse Ashley talk about that. And it's just so interesting because that type of healing is very big in Europe. Sadly, in the Americas, for whatever reason, especially after the war between the states, they went to more of a medical model here. Where in Europe, they continue to kick our rear ends in the more alternative treatments and having a better medical system than we have. And it was just so interesting to learn that, and his whole life in Switzerland, because you would never imagine somebody from Europe being involved in the CSA.
That's true. Of course, I mean, you and I both know, but a lot of folks don't know. There were a lot of Europeans who not only served in the Confederate Army, but held high positions and officer positions even in the Confederate Army. But Major Wirz is one of them. And this picture here, I visited the grave site in 2023 in April. And Major Wirz is a true hero to me. And visiting his gravesite was something I was already in the area to go and see the Arlington Monument. But after we left Arlington Cemetery, the very next stop was that cemetery right there to go and pay our respects to this true patriot. And I had written a majority of my presentation here several years back. So I had already known a lot about the Major's life, and it made this visit to his grave very special, very moving. And I think every member, if you're a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, the Daughters of the Confederacy, MOS&B, or you're just a fellow enthusiast of history who honors those who serve for the South, you should do yourself a favor and go and honor the Major at his gravesite. That's also the place where at least one of the Lincoln assassination alleged conspirators is buried, Mary Surratt, whose grave we also visited. But just knowing what this man did, the sacrifice that he made, I mean, all he would have had to have done, it's much like Sam Davis. If Sam Davis, the boy hero of the Confederacy in Tennessee, the offer was made to him. If you'll just tell me, who it was that put you up to this, we'll let you go. And the guy that did it, that had put him up to it, was sitting in the cell across from him. Now, he could have exchanged his life for his commanding officers. There was no way he was going to do that because he was a man of honor. And the same goes with Henry Wirz. Refusing to name Jefferson Davis or implicate him in any way in the horrors that took place at Andersonville, which were ultimately due to the Union government's own policies. What a true man, a true godly man. That's one that I look forward to standing beside when I go to heaven and worship around the throne of Christ, is my brother Henry Wirz.
Amen to that. And just to be able to interview him, that would be something. Hopefully not for many years, but when it's our time, I want to interview Wirz. I want to interview Wheeler. Just the stories that they would tell, because for those that don't know about Old Capitol Prison, or who have not seen the amazing program that Emily has done on Rose Greenhow, Emily brings the character to life. Rose Greenhow was also housed at Old Capitol Prison with her daughter, who I think was like 8 or 9 at the time, and so was Belle Boyd. So your Old Capitol Prison was usually reserved for political prisoners. A lot of people from Maryland would end up there, or when Lincoln would unleash his wrath of tyranny on the Maryland government, a lot of people he didn't agree with in Maryland, they were sent there at Old Capitol. Some of your Confederate spies were sent there. It was really big, and there's a lot of well-known and some lesser-known people that served time there in Old Capitol. And what really just drove me to research this was just kind of figuring out, okay, well, how did it become the Supreme Court? Because, that whole idea of creating a Supreme Court, which already was controversial way back in the day, even making D.C. was controversial, because we went from a system where the states had more rights to govern themselves to now having one national body of everything. And I don't want to go down my whole rant about the Pledge of Allegiance, but that whole thing about one nation versus all your independent states and sovereign states is another prime example of that. And, people are now believing we should trust the Supreme Court for everything, which is so dangerous, because the reality is all issues need to be thrown back to the states for the states to decide how they want to do stuff. And it wasn't until, get this, 1929 was when Old Capitol Prison was demolished. And you're thinking it's almost, I always liken it to this, right? After World War II, what did the Germans do? They destroyed evidence of stuff that happened. This is basically what the U.S. government did, more or less, is that they didn't want people to know about this. I can promise you all that, if any of y'all watching have graduated from high school recently or in college, college does not talk about Old Capitol Prison. I have not seen a textbook that does or a course that does. High school history, even AP history, there will be no mention of any of the northern prison camps, or I call northern concentration camps. You're lucky if they maybe touch upon Andersonville, but even then, and then when they do talk about Andersonville, it's always the northern side of it.
That's absolutely true. I know I first learned about the Old Capitol Prison when I was doing a personal study on the inaugurations of the United States presidents, and found out that after the War of 1812 and the Capitol had been burned, that at one time this structure, this old brick Capitol Prison, that it was first used as the U.S. Capitol building.
That's right.
And so, that was fascinating to me. And then, of course, once I get into something like that, I always follow the rabbit hole. So I learned more about it and found out that it became a prison during the war between the states and before that. So, but yeah, nobody will ever talk about that. No, nobody ever talks about Elmira and Camp Chase, Camp Douglas. You never hear about those places. The only prison you ever hear about is Andersonville, and they rarely tell the truth.
Oh, yeah. And even to this day, you go to Andersonville, and I hear that for the most part, you do get a lot of the northern stuff that's there still. And the way that documentaries will go there and film, of course, it's shaming the South. But when are you ever going to see them talk about Elmira or Camp Douglas, Camp Rock Island, Governor's Island, Hart Island? Never. Even Fort Delaware. Fort Delaware was given a whole overhaul. And at Fort Delaware, you have a lot of groups that will come out there, like Sons of Union Veterans. You'll have other, pro-union groups that will do events there. And even some of the right-wing political groups will go there, and they'll think that, this is Union, yay, Union. They don't realize how the Confederates were treated and how the POWs are starved and had no food. And, the whole idea of being a political prisoner there. If Old Capitol, I would even argue, is probably deadlier in the sense that you were smack in the middle of DC. So if you could be federally charged, chances are you were getting executed there. They had everything there. Versus Fort Delaware, it was death by starvation. So whether you were going to risk it being illegally tried at a kangaroo court. And, the one thing I always mention when I was teaching history is when they overhauled the textbooks recently, did a whole makeover on them, they removed the Salem witch trials. That whole idea that, when you're tried, there are trials that are kangaroo courts that are not just. This was another example of a witch trial, especially after the war during the, quote, Reconstruction, where certain states like Tennessee didn't, quote, have Reconstruction, but they had persecution. And this was no different here, where they were finding excuses to get back. And you had Union troops that were very bitter about the war that wanted to further cause more harm to the South. When even after the war, the South just wanted to be alone. It wasn't good enough for the Union troops to further invade them after the war, take control of their governments, force them to have these Republican ideologies, and then for generations continue to attack them, some of which is still happening today in some of the southern states.
Well, and I didn't include all of this in the presentation, but Edwin Stanton, who was one of Lincoln's top advisors, a member of Lincoln's cabinet. And of course, he wound up transferring over to Johnson's cabinet once Lincoln was assassinated. Stanton had a sick, twisted desire for vengeance. And after the assassination of Lincoln, he wanted Jefferson Davis so bad that he couldn't see straight. And he was willing to tell any lie or anything that they had to do. Now, thank God, Jefferson Davis was so removed from all of the things that they tried to pin on him that they could never actually execute him or get him to execution without risking a public upheaval, public outcry. The next in line when it comes to Andersonville would have been General Jon I think really the last name is pronounced Winder. I said Winder earlier. But General John Winder. But Winder was already dead. He died in the toward the latter days of the war. So poor Major Wirz just happened to be the next in line, and they poured their wrath out upon him.
He was the easiest target because if you consider what they did after the war, like remember they came after General Forrest.
That's right.
Somebody made some outrage, and I'm going to keep them nameless, but they made an egregious claim that Forrest was somehow friends with Sherman after the war, and I'm like, what on earth are you taking to even think that was, a reality? That could not be farther from the truth. Sherman was absolutely terrified of Forrest. They did meet after the war, but it most likely was not a friendly discussion. And Sherman did then try to persecute Forrest after the war in a court trial, which again used what's called spectral evidence, which is evidence that is irrefutable. You can't say yes or no on it, and it's just hearsay. And if it wasn't for Forrest having enough strength to go through with that and him being a fighter, it could have ended very badly for him. That was extremely high risk. But in the case of Wirz, he had all the odds against him. There was a lot of, Yankees that were stuck in Andersonville, and they blamed Wirz when the reality is they should have blamed Lincoln. It was Lincoln's fault. Why they were there, why they were not traded out, and why they were starved was because of the Union and Yankee blockade. And that's something that, if a lot of these Yankees knew the actual truth, I have a feeling that they would want to erect a memorial of John Wilkes Booth because right, the Yankee Army used propaganda, and they continue to use propaganda for a long time. And one of the things I do have on the radar, not this year, but next year, is I do want to go to the Oddities Museum because I want to see the alleged arm and potentially whatever bone they have or something. Now, we've talked about this. I personally have had my doubts. I don't think that's his real arm because he was alleged to have an injury of some sort, and the arm looks clean. Now, we don't know where his skull is from what I've heard, right? That's still like missing somewhere. I have a feeling that the skull and whatever else is in some private collection somewhere because that is very valuable. That's a really impressive relic to have. When it comes to, the oddities and the fun stuff of history, like this is kind of like the cool part where like, wow, like, what would have happened? Well, we know that medicine at this point in time was not as advanced as it is now. So a lot of stuff was done potentially unethically. However, I think that what they probably did is they made a gaff, which is an item that's false. They probably said, why don't we claim that this is Wirtz's arm and this could be like a cool thing for the museum? And that was something they probably did because, at this point in time, you still had limbs in places. You still had morgues and whatnot. People might not know this, but a lot of the men who died at Camp Douglas up in Illinois, the men that died, because there's very few people buried there, a lot of them were sold to medical colleges and then turned into medical skeletons. Because up until I'd say the mid 1900s, a lot of your anatomy skeletons that you would learn with were made from people, whether they were indigent or prisoners or all that. So chances are a lot of our men in gray could still be somewhere in the different medical museums that house the skeletons.
That's a possibility. I know I was also thinking about the possibility too that it could have been intentionally left with the old brick Capitol and demolished with the building to destroy any evidence of it. That just came to me after I started thinking about it a little more. But you're absolutely right. Medicine was not what it is today, but it was evolving. Medicine today is possible because of the war between the states. So much was learned out of so much gruesome tragedy. But you spoke earlier about Camp Douglas, and also we talked about documentaries and such not being favorable to the truth. There is one documentary that I would encourage anybody to watch, and it was actually produced, of all places, by the History Channel, and it's called 80 Acres of Hell. And it is the true story, or pretty close to the true story, of Camp Douglas. And those guys on that documentary actually tell you that the treatment the awful treatment of these prisoners at Camp Douglas was intentionally cruel, unnecessarily cruel, and that they used stories from Andersonville, whether they were true or not, and they published them in order to create a public outcry and a justification for intentionally treating prisoners cruel in the northern prisons. 80 Acres of Hell. It's still available some places on DVD. I happen to have a copy over on my shelf. But if you ever have a chance to watch it, maybe you can find it on YouTube. I've seen it on there and other places before.
That's right. It's also another very significant day in history, too. You know what today happened today, right, in New York?
What happened in New York?
Some of our Confederate heroes, they decided, you know what? The North has been invading us for far too long, and we need to strike back. They had a special regiment name, which I'm blanking on, and I'm going to see if I can pull it up. But in New York, several Confederates tried to burn down New York back in 1864 today, over 100 years ago.
Right on.
That's right.
And of course, we are approaching into the season of remembrance. It's actually the 160th this year for the Battle of Franklin and also the Battle of Nashville coming in mid-December.
That's right. Oddly enough, though, too, even though some of I think it was about 7 or 8 Confederates that showed up to the, trying to raid New York, the one person was, I believe, pardoned. It was interesting. He tried to pardon, but then unfortunately they didn't pardon him, and they executed. His last name was Kennedy at Fort Lafayette. It's a prison island off Brooklyn, and he was the last execution of the war between the states when it was actively going on. So in the active war, he became the last that we know of Confederate to be executed that way. And then after the war between the states, you still had executions. So I know a lot of like the media, when they write about what happened today, of course, it's the Yankee version of it. And of course, they're, changing things around. Without using names, I attended a presentation, and it was an interesting one. And the person who was giving it, he was trying to justify Sherman's treatments of the Plain Indians after the war, claiming that Sherman had the best welfare for the Indians. And the one guy that ran the Carlisle school, he says, but you know what? They didn't really intend to cause any harm, and all the death was from disease, so it wasn't on them. And I'm like, and he goes, and those Indian parents just wanted to give their children away for a better education in life. And I'm going there like, did they actually read sources?
Wow. How much did the government pay him to say that?
That's what I want to know. I'm like, my jaw is hit the floor. I'm like, I'm not going to say nothing. I'm not going to say it. It was really difficult.
Was it one of those things where after it was over, it said paid for by the friends and descendants of William Tecumseh Sherman?
Yeah, right. The Sherman Society. You can't make it up. It's funny because it's just like, I don't even know what to say at some point.
Well, and I don't know, I want to see the day come when our people can be honored, and those people can honor whoever they want to honor. If they want to honor union guys, let them do it. If they want to honor somebody else, let them do it. As long as you can let us honor our heroes and not blow up at us over it. But at the same time, as long as they're, restricting our freedom to honor our heroes, you do sort of look for that day when it's like, when are their heroes finally going to be exposed and have to face some of the same scrutiny?
I think it's going to be sooner than you think, because what's happening in New York, and again, every year the city has to approve a budget to allocate funds for history preservation and all that. And, back in the day, like 10 years ago, you actually had a lot of good, states that said, okay, let's honor our history like we should in our memorials. And that was not appreciated. And what's happening now is they're using those same funds to remove. And that's why, what New York City wants to do is allocate funding where they can and do it probably in one big swoop and go in and just remove everything and change Revolutionary War names and all that. Because Rev War history is really being attacked up north. Not a lot of people know that, and out west. Much like, the Yankee history is being attacked the same way, that they're coming after them for the treatment of the Indians, and which is ironic because we've been saying that for years. And it's kind of like, hey, we told you so. I'm going to share an image because this is the guy, General. No, I don't think he was a general. Let me get the rank of him. Robert Cobb Kennedy. He was a physician, and during the war, I do not know his rank that he held. I know he was apparently some Confederate spy, but I know he was captured in Michigan.
Interesting.
So it was interesting for sure. And he fled to Canada, and he was apprehended by federal detectives when his train entered Detroit, and then he was transferred back to New York to stand trial. At his capture, he tried to convince the jailer to release him, and that did not happen. So it's pretty gruesome. Like the island they had, it looked like something you'd see out of a Harry Potter movie. Like the New York islands were brutal. He attempted to escape, and then what they did is they put him in a chains so he couldn't get out. So it was
wow.
I don't know where he is buried though, so that would be interesting to find. He was with the 1st Louisiana Rangers.
God bless his memory.
He starts as a lieutenant, so he was a lieutenant. He got a wound at Shiloh. He had a permanent limp, and pretty interesting to learn that. He was captured while carrying dispatches, imprisoned at Johnson's Island. He later escaped using a homemade ladder and skiff, and he escaped into Canada rather than going back down south. So he then was recruited by Confederate spy master Jacob Thompson, who was the head of the Confederate Secret Service. So Johnson's Island, if anyone's been there in Ohio, even today, that's a prime example. At some point, maybe I'll do a little history lesson. I did a small program on the service of Confederate women in Ohio. And the women in Ohio, Confederate women, they don't mess around in Ohio, especially early on in the early days. They took control of Johnson's Island. They did not want to give that up to the federal government. And the early days of the women in the Ohio UDC, they said, nope, we're not doing it. We're not giving up the land. And it was one woman who I'm blanking on her name, but it was not until she died around the 20s and 30s that when she passed on, the ladies were convinced, give over the land. Worst mistake that ever happened, because now government controls that land. They control the narrative. And now they try to tell you how we can honor our history and our memory. And every year they put federal flags on our Confederate soldiers, which is a sign of disrespect. And it's one of those things that, like, why is this still allowed to happen? But so much history happened there, and they don't have any relics that are neat or anything that's cool to talk about the history there. It's usually their own interpretation on their state websites, which ultimately tend to be a Yankee viewpoint.
I live not too awfully far, a couple hours away from Johnson's Island, and I have visited there. And it looks like about once a year they have a day where they invite the public to come, and they actually give tours of where the prison actually was. Anybody can go to the cemetery at any time, but the actual site of the prison is off limits unless you're there with a guide, and that's not a daily based tour or anything. And I was going to go this past year when they had it, but it was terrible weather. Just wasn't going to travel in that weather. But hopefully next year it'll be a better weather day whenever they do it. Plan on going. I'll come back here and I'll report on how honest they are.
That I would love to see that, especially if you can take photographs. Would definitely be so interesting. So that's going to be on definitely the agenda next year. Is you doing that? I'm going to go to the Medical Oddities Museum, see some cool stuff, and see what else, because I know that they have some other cool stuff in there. which I'm excited to see. But I do know that a lot of oddities museums, I don't think you're allowed to photograph. It depends on the museum. I know that there's one in Philly where you can, even though it's very eerie. So I'm going to go see if I can see that one. And I also want to go to the one in Baltimore, which is they call it the Civil War Museum of Medicine, which they include everything from like how amputations were done. And because the amputations, depending on who you had, that was really scary. And like the bone saws and all that, you know, and they didn't have, when they did an amputation, it was pretty much done in ways that your chance of survival was dependent on how high up they had to amputate. And that's just kind of common sense for a variety of reasons. Now, there was a general, no, I don't know if it was general. He was a higher ranking Confederate, but he owned the Moore House, which was later Stonewall Jackson's headquarters. The person that I think that owned it after him was some Confederate that had some rank, and he was injured, and he begged the doctor not to amputate his leg. Well, the good news is he didn't have an amputation. Bad news is the procedure he did was setting the bone, set it in such a way that his leg was permanently stuck straight up and he couldn't bend it.
Oh my God.
Yep. Because bone, they didn't know back then, with bone, it regenerates. So when you break something, you set it and your bone will be able to heal, rejoin everything within reason. Now, should you be one of the unlucky guys that you get hit with a grape shot or something, it shatters the bone? Very unlikely. And then you could either end up on a best case scenario, developing more or less like a type of arthritis where you can't move anything. Worst case scenario, those pieces of bone can cause you to get a septic infection and you're either passing on or you're losing your limb. And I also found this out. Here's the official title of 8 Southern patriots who did that in New York. It was CAM, or the Confederate Army of Manhattan. 8 Southern operatives who attempted to do a scorched earth, payback in New York City. So Sherman did with scorched earth on us. They said, we're going to bring the war right up to you. Right? Fair is fair. What's good for one is good for all. And this occurred on the night of November 25th around 8:45 p.m. And they tried to burn down 19 hotels, a theater, and P.T. Barnum's American Museum. Their goal was to overwhelm the city's firefighting resources by distributing the fires throughout the hotel. And unfortunately, it was not successful. And it was one of those things, they did the best they could with limited resources, and they made an example out of the one person. However, there was an interesting thing that occurred with BBC America. They did a television series called, I believe it was Cooper, and it was created by Tom Fontana. And season 1, episodes 7 through 11 addressed the infiltration of multiple Union cities by nests of Confederates and plots by Confederates to burn down New York City. So they were trying to make what they thought was Greek fire. And it was quite interesting to see how they did that. They also depicted the attempt to burn Lafarge House or Lafarge Hotel on episode 4 of Apple TV's Manhunt. And that was a little series. However, unlike real events, the perpetrator is not apprehended on the spot. So again, it's very like Hollywood-esque. It's not real. It's mostly fiction. There's also novels on it. So this, seemingly forgotten incidents, I guess you could say, was popularized recently in a lot of the media. And of course, you have St. Albans Raid, which we mentioned briefly, and maybe one day we'll do an episode on that. Because St. Albans Raid, everyone thinks of St. Albans, West Virginia, not Vermont.
That's me.
And me too at some point, because when it's St. Albans, I'm thinking like, wait, West Virginia? Like what? Because you figure like Canada, right? Up north, I don't know. And Canada was definitely a hotbed. It was more sympathetic to the Southerners in a lot of ways. And you did have Canadians that fought on the war between the states for the South. And you had a lot of Confederate runaways that would take refuge there. That if they got exiled, they'd be up there. Bell Boyd was deported to England, then deported to Canada.
That's right. You were talking a few minutes ago about the medical oddities and the surgical tools. When I was down at the Confederate Museum in Greenville, South Carolina, and it doesn't matter what museum I go to, if they have a medical display, War Between the States medical display, it's fascinating. It blows my mind, the tools that were used. And you look at it and it's like, oh my gosh, what kind of house of horrors was that? Which it really was a house of horrors in a lot of ways. But as crude as those methods were, they saved an awful lot of lives. And there was this one, it just absolutely just mesmerized me. You know what a hole saw looks like? It's like a little cylinder, and it's got those jagged teeth, might be about yay deep. Well, it was like that, and it had like a handle on it, and they were talking about how it was used when a soldier was wounded in the head and there was swelling, and they had to remove a piece of the skull to release the swelling, to release the pressure. So they would take this hole saw and drill out a piece of the skull. Well, one thing about your skull, if you remove a piece like that from the skull, you cannot just pop it back in there later. It will never grow back like it should. So what did they use? Do you know what they used, Vinny, to close that hole in the skull?
Like what to patch it up with?
Yeah, what did they patch the actual skull with? Do you know?
I'm gonna guess on this and say if they were really lucky and fortunate, they had metal. If they didn't have metal, it was probably leather or something.
Well, what kind of metal? Any guesses?
Bullets bullets, probably iron.
Mexican pesos.
Oh.
Mexican pesos were the perfect size to actually take and affix to the hole, put over that hole. And so you imagine that. How many guys after the war who had their lives saved by that procedure were walking around with Mexican pesos in their head? Can you imagine going through an airport metal detector and your head goes? They're like, what is that? Oh, that's my lucky Mexican peso. It's holding everything in there.
Oh. That to me is just so crazy.
That's just a little fun fact that I learned there at the museum in Greenville. Shout out to those guys. They're awesome.
That's right. And I always think it's interesting too, like a lot of the substances, like the treatments used in the war between the states directly would then cause an increase in addiction. And that when I do my program on Coca-Cola, because for those that don't know, I've worked in addiction studies and I've done training in it. Fascinating to learn the history of all this, because part of your hours on your education is the history of all substances, because every society from the dawn of human time has always been around some kind of substances, good, bad, or indifferent, whether it be leaves on a plant that found out that can make you feel things that weren't there, or potentially, grape juice that went bad without going bad and make wine.
Mushrooms
as well. And the war, they would use a lot of opium products, and people became hooked on morphine. It was crazy. And then you had other drugs like chlorohydrate, where the therapeutic index of this drug is like this much. So if you go a little too much, you are having a lethal dose. And that was an infamous drug because some celebrities died on chlorohydrate. So I know in particular, people don't know this, but Marilyn Monroe, she died of a barbiturate poisoning, and she had about 8 milligrams of chlorohydrate. And that was one of the drugs among many that was found in her system. Do you know what other celebrity that idolized Marilyn Monroe? She died recently. That's another big hint. Who else died on that drug?
Was that? It wasn't Anna Nicole Smith, was it?
It was. And this is something that's so interesting because, there's ethics in medicine, and usually a doctor hopefully has to justify why would they be using something that was formulated in the late 1800s that has been proven to not be effective because of how risky it is. Why were they allowing that? And, because they would recommend a very controlled dose, they were just trusting Anna to have that. And there was reports of her just pouring it in a cup and just downing it, like not even measuring it. And, among other things. And that was something that played a role in her demise, which I do have a program that I've been working on, and it's called Famous People That Have a Confederate Patriot. And it talks about their ancestors as well as the person and how both passed on. So a hint with that is it does include Anna Nicole Smith because she did have Confederate ancestry, and Joan Crawford.
Wow.
So it delves into like the difference, and you'll learn a little bit about their personalities. And, you know, while you can't really diagnose someone posthumously, what would they most likely show traits of? What was very probable? So nothing is like definite, but it is a cool program that will delve into like the mental health history that you can cover as well, because, you know, they didn't have psychologists back then. And it was not until early 1900s that you had therapists that were actually working with veterans. So the field of clinical counseling is actually a little bit older than the field of clinical psychology. And a lot of our veterans, you know, from the war between the states, if they were very lucky and had the money, they were able to go to treatment and get help if they had any issues with any of the addictions. And that was something that was seen in the Confederate Veteran magazine. The early years of those magazines would have. Tennessee had an advertisement about Yay Big, because think about it, right? Tennessee didn't have money after the war. It took them years to even get to a point where they could erect our memorials. It took them ages to build up. But up north, they were well off. And there was a clinic, I think, in Illinois that had an advertisement that was a full page. And they were the first to advertise them to veterans. So knowing what happened after the war, knowing that a lot of these men that were missing limbs and had chronic pain, or, you know, Dr. Pemberton, who made Coca-Cola, he had that saber wound that never healed. That to me is just fascinating. And in some of the medical oddities museums, there will be bottles that will have the old medicines that were used. Strychnine was another one. Or,
yep.
You know, strychnine comes from a plant. It's a very toxic substance. The scientific name for it is Nox vomica. So just like that name, you're going to like puke. And then they're thinking, okay, it's good. We can like purge out the bad. Oh no, very deadly substance.
Well, that's fascinating.
I know our viewers that are watching this, if any of y'all have comments or questions, just put your questions down below, because if it's okay with you, Jon, maybe the next time we're all live, I can pull them up or find something, or you can respond directly to when I post the video on live.
Absolutely. Be happy to.
But thank you so much for coming on here and giving us your time.
Well, thanks for letting me come on. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to go live in front of your audience and talk about some of our Confederate heroes and our history. And I know you and I talking the other day, I'm working on something special for January with the inauguration coming up. So we'll see what January has to offer.
I am so excited for it. Well, that's it for tonight, y'all. I hope y'all enjoy this program. I know I have enjoyed every moment of it, and I've learned a lot as always. Y'all stay Southern, and Deo Vindice, y'all.
Deo Vindice.